Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So this morning we have another sutta study session. We'll be looking at the discourse which I had mentioned yesterday. Somebody had asked how to tell what is correct Dhamma and what is wrong Dhamma. And I had mentioned that there's a discourse to Aya Gotami in the suttas, which explains one way of approaching this. So we can go ahead and pay homage to the Buddha, and then I'll start going through this discourse. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Saṅghaṃ namasami. So the sutta we'll be looking at this morning is from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 8, sutta number 53. So this is from a series of suttas which are about Venerable Mahapajapati Gotami, who was the Buddha's foster mother. So the Buddha's mother passed away a few days after the Buddha was born. So he was raised by his aunt, his mother's sister, who was eventually became the first bhikkhuni. So we generally know her as Mahapajapati Gotami, or simply as Venerable Gotami. And she's known, her main point within Buddhist history was that she was the first bhikkhuni, the first female monk. So the Buddha ordained his aunt, his foster mother. He ordained his ex-wife. He ordained actually countless men and women from his family became Buddhist monks under the Buddha's leadership. The character of Venerable Mahapajapati Gotami is particularly notable in that the Buddha, again, his mother had passed away when the Buddha was very young, so he didn't have a chance to ordain her. Though according to later legend, the Buddha did go to the heaven realms and teach his mother in her next life. So in her life as a deva, the Buddha went and taught her the Dhamma. This is a story that's found in the commentaries. So it's dubious, but still a nice story. But what he did have access to was his foster mother. So he taught her the Dhamma, and eventually, when she became interested in ordination, he gave her ordination, which started the order of bhikkhunis. And this particular discourse is one where she's asking the Buddha for a brief summary of the Dhamma. And there's many suttas where people ask the Buddha for a summary of the Dhamma, and the Buddha gives many different answers. And I tend to find these summary of the Dhamma suttas very interesting, because the Buddha is trying to condense the whole Buddhist path into just a few words or a few statements. And it's often very interesting to see how the Buddha does this. So like what phrasing he uses, what words he uses, and most importantly, what concepts he focuses on as being the ones of central importance. So I'll go ahead and start reading through the discourse in Pali and giving some translation and explanation as we go along. Then if you have any questions, you can type them in and I'll answer them at the end. So the sutta begins. Ekang samayang bhagava vesalayang viharti mahavane kutagara salayam. So on this occasion, the Buddha was living at Vesali. And Vesali is, it's not occupied anymore, but it's still a place that you can go to visit in India. So there's a number of Buddhist monuments in the area of Vesali, including what's considered to be the oldest Buddha stupa. The oldest monument to the Buddha is at Vesali. It's believed to hold ashes from the Buddha's cremation. So he's living at Vesali, and Mahavana was the great forest. At the Kutagara Salayang. So the Kutagara Sala was a peaked roof meeting hall. And it says, Atiko Mahapajapati Gotami Yena Bhagavatenu Upasankami. So then Mahapajapati Gotami approached the Buddha, Upasankamitra Bhagavantang Abhivadetva Ekamantang Atasi, paid respects to him and stood to one side. This is a peculiar point, by the way, the fact that she stood to one side instead of sitting down. So in the suttas, almost always when somebody goes to the Buddha, they pay respects. So they bow to the Buddha and then they sit down to one side. So it's unusual that here Mahapajapati stood to one side. But that's a minor point and it doesn't affect the discourse. Ekamantang tatako sa Mahapajapati Gotami Bhagavantang etaravocha. So when she was standing to one side, Mahapajapati Gotami said to the Buddha, she says, Sadhu me Bhante Bhagava Sankhittena Dhammang de setu. She says, Bhante, it would be good for the Buddha to teach me the Dhamma in brief. Yamahang Bhagavato Dhammang Sutra Eka Vupakata Apamata Atapani Pahitata Vihareyang. He says, having heard the Dhamma from the Buddha, she says, I will live eka. So eka means alone. Vupakata means secluded. Apamata means vigilant, diligent, heedful. So not heedless, not negligent. Atapani, so this means ardent or resolute or committed. It's actually related to the word tapas, which means heat or fire. So it has this sense of like burning with enthusiasm. So enthusiastic. Pahitata means self-directed or committed, devoted. So it has this quality of meaning that you're really pointing yourself intently at doing something. And there's one interesting thing here, by the way, is that these days there's commonly a misperception that bhikkhunis aren't allowed to practice alone in solitude in the forest. But actually, this is one case where Mahapajapati Gotami actually goes to the Buddha and directly says, I'm going to go off and live alone in the forest after you give me this Dhamma teaching. And the Buddha never says anything like, you shouldn't be doing that, or that's not proper, or so on. So it's just kind of taken as a given that, well, of course she's going to go off and practice by herself in solitude. So this is one of the many, many cases in the suttas where it shows that there's nothing wrong with bhikkhunis practicing in solitude. Anyway, so she says she wants to hear a brief Dhamma teaching from the Buddha so that she can go off and practice in solitude with this sincere devotion to attaining some higher realization, some significant progress in the path. And again, it's relatively common in the suttas that we find cases where bhikkhus or bhikkhunis go to the Buddha and make a request like this. They ask for a brief Dhamma teaching, which then they can go off and contemplate in solitude for an extended period of time. And usually the Buddha will give a short Dhamma teaching, and then the person goes off and practices with it and becomes fully awakened. There's a handful of places where the Buddha refuses, where the Buddha tells someone, no, you're not ready yet. You should stay here. But in this case, he didn't refuse. He gave her a teaching as she requested. So he says to her, Ye ko twang Gotami dhamme janayasi. So he says, Gotami, those dhammas which you may know in this way, Ime Dhamma saragaya sangvatanti, no viragaya. So these teachings lead to increased passion, increased lust, increased obsession, not to viraga, not to dispassion, to the diminishment of passion. And sangyogaya sangvatanti no visangyogaya. So they lead to sangyoga, they lead to being more bound, more attached, more fettered, more wrapped up in things. Not to visangyoga. So visangyoga means to be unattached, to be not bound, not tied down. And next it says, achayaya sangvatanti no apachayaya. So achaya means accumulation. So dhammas which lead to accumulation, not to apachaya, means diminution. So it leads to you collecting more stuff. So whether more physical possessions or collecting more identities or collecting more views, rather than diminishing. So shedding one's possessions and accumulations and so on. And next he says, dhammas which mahichataya sangvatanti no apichataya. So mahicchata means having lots of wishes or big wishes, big desires. So maha means big or great. And icha means a wish. So mahiccha means big wishes, great wishes, big desires. So both in the sense of lots of desire, or also desire for grandiose things. So if it leads to mahicchata, so having big desires, lots of desires, not to apichataya. So apicchata means to have few desires or limited wishes. Next, dhammas which are asantutya sangvatanti no santutya. So they lead to discontent, not to contentment. Next, sanganikaya sangvatanti no pavivekaya. So sanganika means to socialize. Sanganika literally means being together with a group. So he says dhammas which lead to lots of socializing, not to paviveka. Paviveka means seclusion, solitude. So teachings which encourage you to spend a lot of time socializing instead of cultivating an appreciation for solitude. And next, kosajjaya sangvatanti no virya rambaya. So kosajja means laziness. And in Buddhism, laziness means particularly not practicing right effort. So not practicing an ongoing effort to cultivate wholesome mind states and discard unwholesome mind states. That's what we mean by laziness. No virya rambaya. So virya means heroic effort or endeavor. So teachings which lead you to being increasingly lazy in training your mind, not towards increasing your heroic effort to train and control your mind. And the final one of the 8 qualities, he says, dhammas which are dubharataya sangvatanti, no subharatayati. So dubhara means difficult to support, a heavy burden. So someone who's hard to take care of, hard to look after, and not subhara. So subhara means someone who's easy to take care of, a light burden, so not difficult to support. So this is especially important to monastics. So since we directly rely upon the support and generosity of lay people, one of the qualities of monastics is that we want to try to be as easy to support as possible. So not being too fussy and demanding about food, robes, lodgings, and medicines, but being pretty willing to accept whatever is sufficient for our needs. So being easy to support, not being a burden on other people. But this also applies to lay people. So even if one is not a monastic, then one still needs to ask oneself, am I being a burden on other people? Am I being hard to deal with, hard to support, hard to look after? Am I being a heavy burden on others rather than a light burden, or optimally no burden at all? So we should try to pose as little burden as possible on the other people in our lives. So the Buddha says, ekang sena gotami dare yasi. And he says, if a Dhamma has any of these 8 qualities, he says, then you can one-sidedly, so ekang sena means one-sidedly, or absolutely, or definitely, or without any doubt whatsoever. You can know, neso Dhammo, neso vinyo, netang sattvasasanam. So neso Dhammo, this is not the Dhamma. Neso vinyo, this is not the training. Netang sattvasasanam, this is not the instructions of the teacher. This is not the Buddha's instructions. So any teaching or practice which increases your lust and passion, that's not the Dhamma. Any practice which leads to being even more attached and bound up in the world, that's not the Dhamma. Anything which leads to accumulation rather than to shedding, that's not the Dhamma. Anything which leads to more and greater desires, that's not the Dhamma. Anything which leads to increased discontent rather than towards increased contentment, that's not the Dhamma. Anything which leads to you doing even more socializing, even more fixated on always being in conversation and chatting and hanging out with people, that's not the Dhamma. Anything which leads towards laziness, so not something that encourages you to constantly train your mind in wholesome states, well, that's not the Dhamma. And anything that makes you hard to support, that makes you a burden on other people, well, that's also not the Dhamma. These 8 basic guidelines. And then the Buddha gives it in the positive formulation. He says, Yechuko tuang gotami dhamme janayasi. He says, and Gotami, those Dhammas about which you know this. Eme Dhamma viragaya sangvatanti no saragaya. So these Dhammas lead to dispassion, not to passion. Visangyogaya sangvatanti no sangyogaya. They lead to being unattached, unfettered, unobsessed, unbound, not towards being attached, fettered, and bound. Apachaya sangvatanti no achayaya. They lead to diminution, discarding, shedding, not towards accumulation. This is really notable every time you have to move, by the way. So here at Empty Cloud Monastery, we usually move rooms every couple weeks or so. So I just moved rooms yesterday. And if you accumulate a lot of possessions, it's a huge hassle to move rooms. You've got to lug all this junk from one room to the other. But if you don't accumulate a bunch of stuff, then you can move from one room to another in 2 minutes. It's really easy. So that was my experience yesterday. Just picked up my stuff, put it in the other room, done. Very easy. But if you accumulate a bunch of junk, then moving is a huge hassle. This also goes for accumulating useless information. That's another thing which we can get into. We can get into like cramming our mind with all kinds of useless information, which also just makes our mind a messy and complicated place, which is difficult to train, difficult to tame. And apichataya sangvatanti no mahichataya. So dhammas which lead to fewness of wishes rather than to great wishes. So fewness of desires. Santutya sangvatanti no asantutya, and which lead to contentment. So this is a major characteristic of the Dhamma. We become increasingly content with things as they are. So training the mind in contentment rather than in learning how to drop our discontent. Pavivekaya sangvatanti no sanigaya. So teachings which lead towards an appreciation for solitude, not towards addiction to socializing. So of course, in monasteries and Dhamma practice, we still need to communicate with people. We still need to talk to people from time to time. And it's important to practice right speech. So learning how to use speech in a wholesome way, a good way, a morally beneficial way. But we also want to learn how to be completely okay just sitting by ourselves in an empty room. Completely okay without anyone to talk to. Completely okay without socializing at all. And so if a Dhamma is helping you to become increasingly comfortable with solitude, then that's a good sign. Virya Rambaya Sangvatanti no kosa jaya. So Dhammas which lead to increasing one's effort, one's heroic endeavor to train the mind. This ongoing effort to cultivate wholesome mind states and diminish unwholesome mind states. And finally, subharataya sangvatanti no dubarataya, and which lead to being easy to support, so not burdensome to others. And he says, ekang sena Gotami darayasi, says, Gotami, you can certainly hold. Eso Dhammo, this is the Dhamma. Eso Vinyo, this is the training. Etang Satu Sasanam, this is the instruction of the teacher. So that's the end of the sutta. So a brief summary of 8 ways of determining what is Dhamma and what is not Dhamma. So can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll take any questions that you might have. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So, hello to some friends joining in online. So hello to Jayanta, Vivian, John, Douglas, SB, Miguel, Gita, Sud, Shamul, Amaranta, Richard, Tenzin, Ashok, and other Gita. So welcome everyone. And I don't see any questions online. Are there any questions from the monastery residents? Yeah.
Does Mahapajapati mean something, like the name itself?
Yeah, it literally means great progenitor. Yeah, Pajapati means one who causes others to be born. That's the literal meaning of Pajapati.
I've seen that word as a designation for Mara.
It's quite possible. It's also the name of one of the high-ranking devas. There's a high-ranking deva named Pajapati who mentioned briefly in Buddhism, but is a big deal in Hinduism. It's also used it's occasionally used just as a stand-in for the word mother. So it's quite possible that Mahapajapati was not her name per se, but rather her title. So this is the case with a number of the names that we find in the suttas seem to be titles indicating a person's status or something like that, rather than their actual name. So Gotami was her clan name. She was from the Gotama clan. So just like Gotama Buddha, Siddhartha Gotama. So Gotami was her clan name, family name. And Mahapajapati might have been her title, the great progenitor, the great mother. So it's possible that we don't actually have her name recorded. It's possible that we just have her title and her family name. We do have a question online. Gita asks, did the Buddha give a similar Sat Sutta or any sutta to Yasodhara? I actually don't remember off the top of my head. The character of Yasodhara she actually doesn't appear that much in the suttas. Except that we know that she became a bhikkhuni and that she became an arhat. But are there any suttas given to Yasodhara? I don't think so. But I would have to do some digging around. I don't think so. Yeah, we know she's it was the name of the Buddha's ex-wife, and that she became a bhikkhuni, but I don't think there's any suttas. I was just doing a search in the Pali Canon, and I didn't come up with anything. I'll look into it a bit more, though, and see if I can find anything, but I don't think so. Sud asks, there are so many instances where Buddha teaches devas, like his mother who passed away, and others who speak with devas, but why don't we see devas contacting humans nowadays? Who said we don't? Of course devas contact humans nowadays. That's never stopped. I think what you mean is, why don't you talk to devas? But that's a question you need to ask yourself. It's always been the case that there are some people who can communicate with devas and some people who can't. That's not changed. It's still the same way these days. Some people can and some people can't. That's not different. And that's the last question from online. Anything else? Yeah.
Maybe seeking some, I don't know if it's a question or seeking wisdom or advice regarding accumulations. I definitely have shedded the material accumulations. And now it's like I've replaced that for spiritual accumulations and knowledge and more information, which is getting in the way of not getting to quieter states of mind. It's actually filling it up more and causing more anxiety and stress. So I don't know if the question is, how you can go about that, balancing that, or letting go of that.
Well, as far as accumulating spiritual information, so the question is always, is this leading towards greater peace, greater compassion, greater contentment? And if the answer is yes, then it's good. If the answer is no, then we might need to reconsider our relationship to that. So accumulating a certain amount of information is actually really useful. Actually, elsewhere in the suttas, in many places, the Buddha says it's worth stockpiling information about the Dhamma. But what he means by that is the suttas themselves. So there's lots of so-called spiritual information, which can be about lots of very interesting things, but which don't lead towards awakening. They don't lead towards peace of mind. They don't lead towards the qualities that are listed here in the sutta. So if information is helping you to develop dispassion, helping you to develop non-attachment, helping you to develop contentment, and so on, then it's pretty good. It's good. But if it's just building up a lot of confusion and doubt and making your mind agitated and unsettled, and then yeah, maybe it's good to put it down and just focus on doing more samadhi practice. Just focus on learning how to focus and steady the mind. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Richard asks, how would you describe the Dhamma in brief? Well, I would actually just copy the Buddha, because realistically, that's all I ever do. I don't make things up. I just repeat things the Buddha said. So the Buddha said, Sabang dhammang nalang abhinavesaya. Nothing whatsoever should be held on to. Or more precisely, what it means is, Sabang dhammang, so all things, nalang, are not sufficient for abhinavesaya, settling on. So nothing is worth settling on. Nothing is possible to settle on. It's not possible to stick to anything. It's not possible to make your home on anything. Nivesana means like a home or a settlement, dwelling place. So don't dwell on anything. Don't make your home on any one thing. So sabang dhammang nalong abhinavesaya. Usually it's translated as nothing whatsoever should be held to, but the more precise meaning is nothing is able to be a true home. No thing is our true home. Richard says, based on your own experience, how would I describe the Dhamma in brief? Based on my own experience. Well, once again, I just wind up copying the Buddha. So I don't really like to make things up. I prefer just to repeat the classics. Sometimes with a little bit of rephrasing to make it more interesting, but that's about it. Yeah, the Dhamma in brief. Noble Eightfold Path. You can't go wrong with that. Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. Yeah. And that's the last of the questions. So, anything else? No? Okay, so we'll go ahead and end the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.